In my first lecture, I discussed the metaphysical base of objectivism, the recognition of the fact that reality is a firm, objective absolute, that everything which exists possesses identity, that consciousness is the faculty of perceiving and identifying that which exists. Last week, I discussed epistemology. Epistemology is the science that studies the nature of human knowledge. I presented the basic pattern of the structure of man's consciousness. Reason as man's faculty of perceiving reality, the process by which man's consciousness proceeds from sensations to perceptions to the formation of abstractions or conceptions, the nature of the subconscious, the nature of emotions, and the fact that emotions come from man's conscious or subconscious premises. This evening I will continue the discussion of epistemology. I will take up the question of what is thinking, what are the standards of correct reasoning, that is, reasoning which gives us actual knowledge of reality. I will discuss that crucial, most unappreciated science, logic. You have all heard the popular misconceptions of the role and function of logic. Most people believe that logic is some dry, formalistic science, a kind of aimless parlor game for unemployed intellectuals who waste their time quibbling over words. Most people believe that logic at best is unrelated to human existence, and at worst is an actual threat to man's enjoyment of life, to his emotions, to his values. You have all heard such popular catchphrases as, the cold hand of logic, men cannot live by logic, etc. Well, let us consider a few examples of how men do live, and if there is such a thing as a cold hand that sweeps over their lives at time, leaving desolation in its wake, what is its nature and its cause? These examples are instances of the kind of suffering which, in one form or another, all men encounter in the course of their lives. Suppose you work in an office, you are doing an excellent job and your boss praises you highly. But when the time comes for a promotion, he gives it to another man who is blatantly incompetent and undeserving. You are left with a bitter feeling of disappointment. If you try to find an explanation for the injustice, you will probably conclude that your boss was hypocritical, or that he was cruel, or, if your thinking is not too precise, you might go so far as to blame the capitalist system, deciding that all employers are hypocritical and cruel. What you probably will not realize is that hypocrisy and cruelty are not primaries, and they explain nothing. That they come from a deeper cause, and that the real essence of the boss's injustice toward you, the real root of his evil, was the fact that he acted illogically. Suppose you are in love with a girl and engaged to marry her. Suddenly, without warning or explanation, she refuses to see you or to answer the telephone when you call. A few months later, you learn that she had eloped with a man she had met the day before and had married on the whim of the moment. You might explain her behavior by concluding that she was dishonest or promiscuous, or that all love and sex are evil. But the real cause and essence of her evil was that she had acted illogically. Suppose you are a research scientist and, after years of desperately hard work, you succeeded in solving the problem that had been your goal. It is a great achievement and a great moment for you. You rush to the man who is your best friend to share the news with him. He listens indifferently, says, "How nice," and proceeds to tell you the latest football scores he heard on television. You might explain it to yourself by concluding that he is insensitive or hypocritical, or that true friendship is impossible among men. But the real cause and essence of his evil is that he had not given you any thought. He had acted illogically. If you look back and analyze any instances of disappointment, disillusionment, or suffering you have endured in your relationships with people, any harm or injury they have done to you, you will find that under all the other more superficial causes, the basic cause was their irrationality, their refusal to think, their lack of logic. Any feeling of bitterness, suspicion, futility that you may now have in regard to men, the feeling that it is hopeless to expect any fairness, kindness, or understanding from them, comes from the countless instances stored in your subconscious of the bewildering inconsistencies, contradictions, evasions, injustices you have encountered in dealing with people. Instances of human irrationality, of the illogical demands made of you, of the illogical responses to you. And I venture to add regretfully, in such cases where you have caused pain or injury to others, you have done it by being irrational, by acting thoughtlessly, illogically. You have all heard the phrase so frequently used as a lament by altruists and humanitarians, man's inhumanity to man. I wish to state that the essence of this inhumanity, the factor responsible for it, is irrationality, and that no other single factor, not even deliberate sadism, has caused the suffering and destruction comparable to that caused by the irrationality of well-meaning, good-intentioned people in the history of mankind and in the personal histories of individual lives. The suffering that erodes and destroys man's spirit, undercuts his self-esteem, shrivels his ambition, wipes out his incentives, kills his enjoyment of life. The suffering that drains the enthusiasm of youth and brings an eager, curious, benevolent child to that state of gray, cynical lethargy, which in our present culture is regarded as adulthood. What is sadism when compared to that slow, daily, all-pervading process of murder in which well-meaning people are constantly engaged? Besides, sadism too is only the manifestation, the result of irrationality. The irrational is the unthinking. It is the willful defiance of reason. To act illogically is to exhibit contradictions in one's behavior. Now, in this context, let me read to you again the quotation read in the first chapter, a quotation from Will Durant's popular Story of Philosophy. Quote, "But no man ever lived who could lift logic to a lofty strain. A guide to correct reasoning is as elevating as a manual of etiquette. We may use it, but it hardly spurs us to nobility. Not even the bravest philosopher would sing to a book of logic underneath the bough." Close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, Atlas Shrugged is a hymn to logic, to the power and importance of logic. You will have observed that the 3 parts of Atlas Shrugged are named after the 3 Aristotelian laws of logic: non-contradiction, either or, A is A. The generally accepted dictionary definition of logic is the art of correct reasoning. This is true, but it is a description rather than a definition. It defines the field with which logic deals, the field of reasoning, but it leaves open the question of what is correct in reasoning. Ayn Rand has answered that question with a specific definition. Logic is the art of non-contradictory identification. The full importance of this definition will become clear to you as we discuss the nature of logic. In the process of acquiring knowledge, of moving from the perception of concretes and particulars to the formation of wider and wider abstractions and concepts, and in the applying of concepts to new particulars, new concretes, man's mind does not function infallibly. Error is possible to man. Therefore, man needs a standard by which he can judge the truth or falsehood of his conclusions, the validity or invalidity of his thinking. He does not possess such a standard automatically or innately. His mind must discover it. That standard is logic. Aristotle was the father of the science of logic, the first man who formulated the principles of correct thinking, the principles that all men must obey if the attainment of truth is their purpose. The 3 Aristotelian laws of logic are the law of identity, the law of contradiction, the law of excluded middle. The last 2 are merely corollaries or restatements of the first. The law of identity states that everything which is what it is, that a thing is itself, that a thing's identity is that which it is. In algebraic formulation, the law of identity is stated as A is A. The law of identity was discussed in the first lecture as the basic principle of metaphysics. It is crucially important now to realize that the law of identity is also the basic principle of epistemology. It is the link between the 2 sciences, the bridge between existence and consciousness, between reality and knowledge. As a principle of metaphysics, the law of identity tells us that everything which is is what it is. As a principle of epistemology, it tells us that contradictions cannot exist, that a thing cannot be A and not A, and therefore, if we reach a contradiction in our thinking and draw two contradictory conclusions about the same thing in the same context, we have made an error. Our thinking is wrong. Our thinking does not correspond to reality, and we must check our conclusions, our reasons for them, our premises. The law of contradiction and the law of excluded middle are specifically epistemological restatements of the law of identity. They are epistemological rules to guide man's thinking. The law of contradiction states that nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. Thus, if the law of identity states that a table is a table, then the law of contradiction states that nothing can be a table and not a table at the same time and in the same respect. A tablecloth cannot be green and non-green at the same time and in the same respect. Contradictions cannot exist. At the same time and in the same respect, no attribute can be present and absent, no effort can succeed and fail to succeed, no action can be good and not good, no entity can be man and not man, no man can be alive and dead. It is the law of contradiction which teaches us that if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, it is rational to infer that Socrates is mortal and irrational to conclude that he is not. That if a theory conflicts with the facts of reality, the theory must be rejected. That a theory to be valid must integrate all and clash with none of the relevant evidence. That if a scientist's investigations lead him to the formulation of two mutually exclusive hypotheses, at least one of these hypotheses is wrong. That no proposition can be both true and false. That if a mother simultaneously demands of her children that they think independently and that they obey her on blind faith, she is not a practitioner of rationality. And neither is an employer who gives switching and irreconcilable orders, and neither is a moralist who preaches that self-abnegation leads to self-fulfillment, and neither is a political theorist who declares that men can achieve freedom only by establishing a slave society. Logic is the art of non-contradictory identification. The law of excluded middle states that everything is either A or non-A at a given time and in a given respect. For instance, either this is a table or it is not a table. Either this tablecloth is green or it is not green. Observe, and this is very important, that I have not said either this is a table or it is a chair. I have said either this is a table or it is not a table. I have said either this tablecloth is green or it is not green. In accordance with the law of excluded middle, I could also have said either this tablecloth is red or it is not red. This would be true in regard to this particular tablecloth. It is not red. But I could not say as a universal principle, either this tablecloth is green or it is red. This would be an obvious absurdity. A tablecloth may be green or red or blue or yellow or plaid or polka-dotted, etc. But whatever color a particular tablecloth happens to be, the universal alternative is only that color or not that color, green or not green, red or not red, polka-dotted or not polka-dotted, etc. This particular identity or not this particular identity, without specifying any other kind of particular identity. The law of excluded middle states everything is either A or non-A. It does not state everything is either A or B. At a given time and in a given respect, either an attribute is present or it is absent. Either an effort has succeeded or it has failed to succeed. Either an action is good or it is not good. Either an entity is man or it is not man. Either a man is alive or he is dead. Either a proposition corresponds to the facts of reality or it does not. But no third alternative is possible. There is no middle of the road between truth and non-truth. There is no compromise between existence and non-existence. The question is sometimes asked, why are the laws of identity, contradiction, and excluded middle regarded as the laws of logic rather than other such logical principles as, if A implies B and B implies C, then A implies C, or if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C? The answer is that these latter formulations are narrower and less fundamental. They are specialized applications of the law of identity. They are not as wide or as comprehensive. The law of identity and its two basic corollaries, the laws of contradiction and of excluded middle, are the fundamental laws of logic because they are the most universal and all-inclusive. They have application to everything that exists and to all propositions. There are certain common misconceptions and misrepresentations of these three laws of logic, by means of which the laws are frequently attacked. You will often, for instance, hear the following argument against the law of excluded middle. It's not true that everything is either A or non-A, because it's not true that everybody is either rich or poor. Some people have middle incomes. Now, the law of excluded middle does not hold that everybody is rich or poor. It holds that everybody is either rich or not rich. Or consider this argument against the law of contradiction. This law states that nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. Suppose you say that a white rose is white, which, to be precise, means that the color of its petals is white, and someone then proceeds to claim the law of contradiction will be invalidated a week later when that rose will fade and become brown. He is obviously ignoring the specific content of that law. The law of contradiction does not claim that a white rose cannot become brown in changed conditions. It merely claims that a rose cannot be white and brown at the same time. Now suppose that person asks, but what about that rose in the process of fading? Wouldn't it be both white and brown at the same time? And of course the answer is, not in the same respect. Part of its petals would be white, other parts would be brown, perhaps some parts would be whitish brown, but no petal or part thereof would be white and brown at the same time. Besides, the exact identification of that particular rose at that particular time would be a white rose in the process of fading. A very common attack on the law of identity goes as follows. It's not true that A is A. It's not true that a boy is a boy because he's a boy today, but in a few years he'll be a man. Now, the fact that in a few years a boy will be a man does not change the fact that at any and every moment of his life he is something specific. That a boy is a boy, that an adolescent is an adolescent, that a youth is a youth, that an adult is an adult. The fact that an entity contains a potentiality for change inherent in its nature does not contradict the fact that that entity is what it is, that it is itself, and the changes possible to it will be determined by its nature, by that which it is. Thus, a boy will grow into a youth, then into an adult, then into an old man. He will not grow into an ostrich, then into an old man, then into a chair, then into a pig. You will sometimes hear nonsense to the effect that the laws of logic are static and constricting, that they do not acknowledge or allow the dynamic possibility of change, motion, time, etc. Well, it is precisely the laws of logic that make it possible for man to deal with change, motion, and time. They expand man's view past the range of the immediate moment and make it possible for him to predict the future changes of a presently existing entity, as well as the conditions of such changes. They make it possible for a civilized mother not to fear that her baby will change into a bat or a wolf, as medieval mothers used to fear. They also make it possible for a man who is about to kill a cockroach not to worry whether that cockroach is his grandfather, as many inhabitants of India do believe to this day. The only kind of dynamism which the laws of logic do not allow is the possibility of having one's cake and eating it too. As you observe, the laws of logic demand of you an absolute precision in your use of words and concepts. When I say absolute, I do not mean omniscient. If you use the word man, for instance, you do not have to know everything that could possibly be known about man, but you do have to know what you know, and you do have to know the exact meaning and context in which you use the concept man, in order to avoid such traps as the one involved in the example of a boy growing into a man. If you wish to be logical, if you wish your thinking to be efficient, if you wish to avoid contradictions, then, to put it in simple colloquial terms, you must always know what you are talking about. It is the laws of logic that guide us in the process of thinking, of drawing conclusions from our observation of the world. Obviously, in order for our reasoning to yield us an actual knowledge of reality, it is necessary not only that our thinking be free of any internal contradictions, but that the premises with which we start be true. The base of our knowledge is, of course, our direct and immediate perceptions. Perceptions are the given, the self-evident. The meaning of self-evident is available to direct, immediate awareness. The law of identity is the abstract statement of a self-evident fact. The fact that things are what they are. The difference between the self-evidence of sensory perceptions and the self-evidence of the conceptual metaphysical axiom of identity is only this. The axiom is implicit in every perception. Man is aware of it directly with every perception, but he requires an accumulation of perceptions, an accumulation of knowledge, before he can formulate the axiom. A baby, as we have said, is implicitly aware of the law of identity with his first sensory awareness of reality, but he cannot identify it consciously, and he cannot formulate it into a conceptual statement until much later. It is only when man grasps the law of identity that he gains control over his conceptual knowledge. By means of this axiom, he can retrace his knowledge, he can check the validity of any concepts, abstractions, and inferences he has drawn so far, check them by retracing them back to their base in perceptual reality, in his direct, immediate perceptions. He can bring his knowledge, his mental files, into non-contradictory order, and then he can go forward in pursuit of new knowledge as a fully conscious adult and thinker, now armed with the standard by which he can test the validity of all his conclusions and inferences. Thus, the axiom of identity may be described as a delayed immediate perception. Immediate in the sense that it is perceived directly. Delayed in the sense that it has to wait for a conceptual formulation before it can enter man's conscious awareness and change from the implicit to the explicit. The same principle, of course, applies to the other logical axioms, that is, to metaphysical axioms, axioms implicit in the concept of existence or being as such. To quote from Galt's radio speech, quote, "An axiom is a statement that identifies the base of knowledge and of any further statement pertaining to that knowledge. A statement necessarily contained in all others, whether any particular speaker chooses to identify it or not. An axiom is a proposition that defeats its opponents by the fact that they have to accept it and use it in the process of any attempt to deny it." Close quote. This last sentence is an answer to the neo-mystics who claim that there are no self-evident axioms, that philosophical axioms are a matter of faith or arbitrary choice, that anyone can choose anything he pleases as a philosophical axiom, and that any choice is as valid as any other. Which would mean, of course, that man's knowledge rests on thin air, on subjective whim, that faith is as valid as reason and science, that there is no such thing as knowledge. The test to determine what is an objective philosophical axiom is not the number of people who may or may not accept it, but the fact that no statement, proposition, concept, abstraction, claim, knowledge, or pretense at knowledge is possible or definable without it, and that all attempts to deny it contain it implicitly. For instance, if a man chooses to claim as an axiom that the universe was created by green gremlins, one can refute him without using the concept of green gremlins and without having to accept their existence implicitly in one's argument. But if a man claims that he does not choose to accept the law of identity, he has already accepted it implicitly in the fact that he has uttered a specific sentence of a specific meaning, that he intends his sentence to be what it is and to mean what it means, and not the opposite. An axiom does not require proof, it is that on which all proof rests. The laws of logic are axiomatic. They are merely the restatements of the law of identity. They are not inferred or deduced, they are the means which make inference and deduction possible. They require no proof, they are the means of proving. To demand, as the neo-mystics demand, that the axioms of logic be proved is to evade the meaning of the concept of proof. Proof is a process of inference. It consists of establishing that a proposition is true by deriving it from previous knowledge. This implies the existence of previous knowledge, which is axiomatic and self-evident, as distinguished from inferred knowledge, which requires proof. If no self-evident knowledge existed, if all knowledge required proof, If all propositions had to be derived from earlier propositions, there would be an infinite regress in the chain of reasoning. Knowledge would have no starting point. It would have to start out of nothing, out of zero, out of non-knowledge. This means that there could be no such thing as knowledge and no such concept as proof. One proves a proposition by demonstrating that it is logically necessitated, that its denial would contradict facts already known to exist. If no facts are or can be known directly and self-evidently, there can be no proof and no such concept as logical necessity. Since logic is the standard of proof, since it sets the principles of proof, by what means and by what standard is logic to be proved? Until one has grasped that A is A and that contradictions cannot exist, there can be neither proof nor even the concept of proof. Those who demand proof for axioms and for the laws of logic are guilty of the fallacy of ignoring the genetic roots of concepts, the fallacy of the stolen concept which we discussed last week. It is only the concept of logical axioms that makes the concept of proof possible. The law of identity is a genetic root of the concept of proof. Those who claim that they do not accept the law of identity can no longer claim any meaning for the concept of proof and cannot ask that anything be proved. Strictly speaking, the neo-mystics of today do not literally demand that the axioms of logic be proved, or rather, the demand is implicit rather than explicit. It is contained in their assertion that since the laws of logic cannot be proved, they cannot be known to be true, they cannot be known to apply to reality. Today it is fashionable among modern philosophers to assert that the axioms of logic are arbitrary. But this is to confess that one has forgotten how such a concept as the arbitrary was originated. An arbitrary idea is one accepted by chance, caprice, or whim. It stands in contradiction to an idea accepted for logical reasons, from which it is intended to be distinguished. The existence of such a concept as an arbitrary idea is made possible only by the existence of logically necessary ideas. The former is not a primary, it is genetically dependent upon the latter. To maintain that logic is arbitrary is to empty the concept arbitrary of meaning. To declare that the axioms of logic are hypotheses or merely probable is to be guilty of the same contradiction. The concept of the hypothetical or of the probable acquires meaning only in contradistinction to the known, the certain, the logically established. It is not a primary. Only when one has grasped something which is certain can one arrive at the idea of that which is not, and only logic can separate the latter from the former. Many neo-mystics contend that the axioms of logic are accepted, not because they are known to be true, but because they work, because they are practical. To contend this is to evade the question of how one decides what is or is not practical before one has grasped that that which is, before one has acknowledged that A is A. Many neo-mystics assert that the axioms of logic do not pertain to existence and do not reflect the nature of reality, that they pertain only to language, that they merely express the manner in which men have agreed to use words and connect propositions, and that men could have chosen otherwise. To assert this is to make the use of language a matter of arbitrary whim, to make thought a matter of arbitrary whim, and to place oneself in the category of a schizophrenic. It is the schizophrenic who does not believe that his statements or method of inference need bear any necessary correspondence to the facts of objective reality. Those who contest the self-evident certainty of the law of identity are unable to escape its implicit acceptance and use. They seek to prove their claims by means of the very logic they deny. They use concepts such as infer, demonstrate, arbitrary, hypothetical, probable, which only the axiom of identity makes possible. They attempt to adduce evidence for their position, assuming that their evidence is something, that it is what it is. They argue, implying that if their theory is true, it is not simultaneously false. They cannot escape that which they seek to reject, because existence is identity. Just as man cannot, without contradiction, contest that A is A, so he cannot contest that he is able to know it. Just as it is an axiom that existence exists, so it is an axiom that consciousness is conscious. In principle, it is a single error to demand that the axioms of logic be proven and thus to imply that there can be proof prior to logic, or to demand that existence and consciousness be proven and thus to imply that there can be proof prior to existence and consciousness. The error consists of ignoring the hierarchical structure of knowledge, of ignoring the genetic roots of concepts, of treating complex ideas as primaries and using them to attack the more fundamental concepts from which they were derived and without which they would not be possible. Philosophers have recognized the fallacy of question begging, the fallacy of assuming as true that which one wishes to prove and using it as part of the proof. But it is equally a fallacy to assume and to use that which one wishes to disprove. Existence, consciousness, and identity are the presuppositions of any demand for knowledge and any claim to knowledge. They are the irreducible base of all human thinking. Logic, like all of philosophy, is a science that applies to all specialized sciences and makes all specialized sciences possible. Logic does not teach us the content of any specific knowledge, it teaches us the process of acquiring any and all knowledge. Logic is the tool of reason. Logic is based on facts, on the fact that that which is, but it is not a science of facts, it is a science of method. It is imperative always to remember what we have established about the hierarchical nature of man's knowledge. Man's concepts, inferences, and conclusions rest on earlier concepts, inferences, and conclusions, which ultimately rest on direct, immediate percepts and on the law of identity. Man's knowledge is a long, integrated chain, no part of which is valid out of context without the genetically antecedent parts. It is like a skyscraper in which no story can stand without the lower stories, and these cannot stand without the foundation. There can be no such thing as out-of-context knowledge. All knowledge is acquired on the base of previous knowledge and can be no better than that base. All knowledge is contextual, which means has to be integrated, has to form a logical, consistent, non-contradictory whole. All thinking, states Galt, is a process of identification and integration. All logic is a process then of context keeping. No conclusion of a formally logical argument can be considered true out of context. Only a full context can determine its truth or falsehood. And in a full context, the logically true is the factually or existentially true. It is utterly indefensible to speak of logical truth as opposed to or apart from factual truth or existential truth. If a statement is true at all, it can be true only of reality. There is nothing else for a statement to be true of, nothing else to which the concept of truth can meaningfully or validly be said to pertain. People often reveal an excessively narrow view of what it means to be logical when they maintain that a bank robber is logical because he devises an ingenious, complicated scheme for robbing a bank. It is true that the bank robber does employ logic in his calculations, but this does not mean that his action, in the total context of his knowledge, was a logical one to undertake. Enormous irrationalities, evasions, and breaches of logic were necessary to bring him to the decision of becoming a bank robber. Everyone uses logic at some time or another in his life, on some subject or another. But these occasions often may be logical only in the formalistic, out-of-context sense of the word. An illustration of this would be a neurotic parasite who lives by mooching off his friends and saves his logic for playing chess. If you understand that the principles of logic are based on the metaphysical nature of reality, you will understand the grotesque irrationality of any doctrine of polylogism. Polylogism means many logics. Polylogism claims that there is no one universal logic, but there are many different logics. The salient exponents of this idea are the Russian communists, who claim they have a special proletarian logic as opposed to our bourgeois logic, and the German Nazis, who claimed that they had a special Aryan logic as opposed to the non-Aryan logic of the rest of the world. The motive of such claims is, of course, obvious. They make it possible for any criticism to be refuted by the simple expedient of declaring that it is based on bourgeois or non-Aryan logic and is thus invalid. This is blatant subjectivism, subjectivism applied to epistemology in the same manner as they apply it to metaphysics. This is mysticism, as any subjectivist doctrine necessarily is. Just as there can be no such thing as two or more different realities, so there can be no such thing as two or more different logics. Reality is that which exists. Logic is the art of non-contradictory identification of that which exists. To possess a different kind of logic would mean to possess the art of contradictory identification, which in fact is what the advocates of polylogism do possess in practice. Whatever you may wish to call it, it is not logic. Sometimes you may hear references to the logics of different sciences, such as mathematical logic. This is an unfortunate misnomer. A set of methodological rules that apply to a special science are not a special logic. They are only the application of a philosophical logic to the specific problems of the specific science. Before concluding our discussion of logic, there is one final issue to which I should like to turn. I want you to understand a very important methodological principle, namely that it is impossible to prove a negative and irrational to attempt it. By a negative in this context, I mean a negative for which no positive exists, such as the attempt to prove that one is not guilty when no positive proof of one's guilt has been offered, or the attempt to negate something for which there is no positive evidence. In colloquial terms, this fallacy would consist of some arbitrary assertion, followed by the challenge, prove that it isn't so. Proof, logic, reason, thinking, knowledge pertain to and deal only with that which exists. They cannot be applied to that which does not exist. Nothing can be relevant to or be applied to the non-existent. The non-existent is nothing. And here I will ask you to remember what was said about the literal meaning of nothing in the first lecture. Any human statement and any claim to knowledge must refer to something that exists or be derived from something that exists or be based on something that exists. But an arbitrary statement based on nothing can be said to exist only in the sense that it is a series of sounds uttered by a human being. As far as its content is concerned, it refers, epistemologically speaking, to nothing. A positive statement derived from some erroneous evidence can be refuted by means of proving the errors of the alleged evidence. Such refutation would be the disproving of a positive. This is not the same thing as proving a negative. That is, proving an error or falsehood of a statement for which no evidence of any kind exists. For instance, if I said that the side of the moon which we see consists of mountains and dead volcanic craters, I would have to offer you scientific evidence to prove it. But if I said that the other side of the moon consists of rose gardens and Coca-Cola factories, and you asked me for proof, and I answered, my proof is the fact that you can disprove it, no one could blame you if you decided not to pursue the conversation any further, and thereafter not to hold any serious conversations with me at all. But much as my method of thinking would be reprehensible in such a case, there is a mental attitude more reprehensible still. This is the attitude of some third person who, after hearing our conversation, would shrug and draw the following conclusion. Well, maybe the other side of the moon does consist of rose gardens and Coca-Cola factories, and maybe it doesn't. Who am I to know? If I, in this example, acted like a mystic openly at war with reality, then he, the neutral observer, was guilty of something worse. He granted equal status to mysticism and reality, refusing to differentiate or take sides between them. In the realm of knowledge, reason, and logic, there is no place for whims. A zero is not given the same status as an entity, the non-existent is not considered on a par with the existence, and nothing is not taken as equal to a something. Every claim, statement, or proposition has to be based on reality. Nothing may be claimed causelessly, groundlessly, arbitrarily, by whim. Even a hypothesis has to have some factual basis, some rational evidence indicating that it might be true. A hypothesis based on nothing but a blind guess is not admissible into rational consideration. Reason deals only with that which exists. Any hypothesis or supposition that some hitherto unknown fact may exist has to be based on the evidence of the facts known to exist. The absence of knowledge in any subject does not constitute a basis for inventing arbitrary theories and groundless explanations. An absence cannot be a basis for anything. The fact that something is unknown does not give you license to substitute invention for inquiry, and will not transform the products of your invention into knowledge. Nor can you invert logic to the point of claiming that that which has not been proven to be impossible is therefore possible. One must be able to prove that something is possible. It is not an accident that under the British and American Code of Law, a man is presumed to be innocent until he is proved guilty, but under the Soviet Code of Law, a man is considered guilty until he has proved himself innocent. Try to imagine what it would be like to live under the constant threat of being found guilty of undefined crimes on unspecified charges, and of having to prove your innocence where no standard of truth or innocence exists. To understand fully the irrationality of the demand for proof of a negative, concretize what this principle would mean if applied consistently in a court of justice. Suppose that you are suddenly arrested and brought to trial. The prosecutor asserts, without any further details, that you have committed a murder and demands that you prove you have not. You ask, what murder? He does not answer. He does not have to prove your guilt. You have to prove your innocence. You ask, who was killed? He does not have to answer nor to produce any corpus delicti. Why do you suspect me? He does not have to have any reasons. Well, how will you proceed to prove anything? You cannot produce witnesses to prove that you were at home with your family. You do not know when the murder was committed. You cannot prove that you were miles away from the scene of the crime. You do not know where the murder was committed. You cannot prove that you never owned a lethal weapon. You do not know how the murder was committed. You cannot prove that you had no motive for the crime. You do not know what sort of motive the circumstances of the murder implied. And not knowing the identity of the victim, you cannot prove the nature of your relationship to every human being on earth, known to you or unknown. You can prove nothing because nothing can be derived from nothing. In a rational society and among rational men, the burden of proof for any assertion rests on the man who makes the assertion. But among mystics, the burden of proof against any assertion rests on the listeners or the victims, and then anything goes, particularly human lives. Now it must be clear to you that logic, as well as the whole structure of man's knowledge, rests on the axiom of the law of identity. The process of acquiring knowledge is a process of discovering the identities of things in greater and greater detail, and of discovering the causal principles that govern their actions. This brings me to what may be called the first theorem of our philosophy, the first metaphysical principle to be derived from its basic axiom, the law of causality. To quote Galt's speech, quote, "The law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. All actions are caused by entities. The nature of an action is caused and determined by the nature of the entities that act. A thing cannot act in contradiction to its nature." Close quote. All actions in the universe are actions of entities, and the actions possible to an entity are determined by its nature. What a thing can do depends on what it is. It is not chance, it is not the whim of demons or of mysterious gods. It is in the nature of the entities involved that a seed can grow into a flower, but that a stone cannot. That a bird can fly, but that a building cannot. That electricity can run a motor, but that tears, screams, and prayers cannot. That actions consistent with their natures are possible to entities, but contradictions are not. Just as what a thing can do depends on what it is, so in any specific situation, what a thing will do depends on what it is. Every action is caused by the nature of the entities that act. If iron is exposed to a certain temperature, it expands. If water is exposed to the same temperature, it boils. If wood is exposed to the same temperature, it burns. The differences in their actions are caused by the differences in their properties. If an automobile collides with the bicycle, it is not chance that the bicycle is hurled into the air rather than the automobile. If an automobile collides with a train, it is not chance that the automobile is hurled into the air rather than the train. Causality proceeds from identity. To maintain that there could be action without entities that act is to commit the fallacy of the stolen concept. It is to forget that the concept of action logically requires and presupposes that which acts and would not be possible without it. The universe consists of entities that act, move, and change, not of disembodied actions, motions, and changes. To deny that actions are caused by entities, to deny that what a thing does is determined by what it is to imply that any entity can perform any action, which means that an electron can write a symphony, a building can grow wings, a leaf can turn into a lion, a man can simultaneously depart in two different directions, which means that an entity can do that for which its nature contains no potentiality, which means contradictions are possible. Such was the view of reality held by primordial savages who regarded every event in the universe as an inexplicable miracle bound by nothing save the unknowable whim of unknowable demons. And when today prominent scientists who find themselves unable to ascertain the causal principles exhibited in the behavior of subatomic particles decide that the solution lies in declaring that causality is invalid and that the particles act as they do for no cause whatever, it is to the metaphysics of those primordial savages that their contention would reduce mankind. The conviction of order in the universe is an act neither of faith nor of hope. Its sanction and proof is the axiom that existence exists. The law of causality is implied and necessitated by the law of identity. Together they constitute the basis of all knowledge. Only because everything that exists is something specific, only because it possesses a nature and must act in accordance with that nature, are abstraction, induction, and prediction possible to man. To explain an event is to define its cause, to specify the conditions that necessitated its occurrence, to identify those attributes of the acting entities that caused them to act as they did. Science was born only when primitive man abandoned the practice of explaining events in terms of gods and demons, only when he saw that he accounted for nothing by saying that fire flashed in the sky, that rivers overflowed and the flowers blossomed because the god of fire, of water, or of the field so decreed. Only when he recognized that this merely was saying that a mysterious something caused these phenomena, but not what or how. Only when he began to seek causal principles to account for the action of things, with reason, not faith in a mystic unknowable, as his means of understanding. But one form of the primitive man's pre-rational method of explanation has never fully been rejected, but has been perpetuated by philosophers and theologians down the ages. The belief in a God, not of fire or water or of the fields, but of the universe, whose wishes and actions explain the fact that existence exists. The postulate of a creator of the universe has less excuse than that of gods of wind and rain. The existence of wind and rain does require a causal explanation. The existence of the universe does not. The universe is the total of that which exists. Within the universe, the emergence of new entities can be explained in terms of the actions of entities that already exist. The cause of a tree is the seed of the parent tree. The cause of a machine is the purposeful reshaping of matter by men. All actions presuppose the existence of entities, and all emergences of new entities presuppose the existence of entities that cause their emergence. All causality presupposes the existence of something that acts as a cause. To demand a cause for all of existence is to demand a contradiction. If the cause exists, it is part of existence. If it does not exist, it cannot be a cause. Nothing cannot be the cause of something. Nothing does not exist. Causality presupposes existence. Existence does not presuppose causality. There can be no cause outside of existence or anterior to it. The forms of existence may change and evolve, but just as the irreducible primary on which all subsequent knowledge rests is the axiom that existence exists, so the fact of existence is the irreducible primary at the base of all causal chains. Existence, not God, is the first cause. Just as the concept of causality applies to events and entities within the universe, but not to the universe as a whole, so the concept of time applies to events and entities within the universe, but not to the universe as a whole. The universe did not begin. It did not at some point in time spring into being. Time is a measurement of motion. Motion presupposes entities that move. If nothing existed, there would be no time. Time is in the universe. The universe is not in time. This is the full meaning of the concept of existence as an irreducible primary. That every attempt to go outside existence or beyond it, every attempt to place it in time, to ascribe to it an antecedent cause, to demand that it be proved, leads inexorably to logical contradictions. Epistemologically, all such attempts represent the fallacy of the stolen concept. Metaphysically, all such attempts demand that one step into non-existence, that one enter a nothing in order temporally, causally, or logically to explain a something. That non-existence does not exist, nothing is nothing, existence exists, and only existence exists. One of the characteristics of a rational man is his respect for the law of causality, his concern with knowing what causes are needed to achieve his goals and what will be the effect of achieving them. One of the chief characteristics of irrationalists is their attempt to escape the law of causality, their desire to obtain effects without having to enact the causes, and their desire to get away with certain actions without any responsibility for the effects. As examples of the first, that is, of the desire for effects without causes, the man who wants to be famous as a writer but does not want to learn the difficult skill of writing. The woman who wants to be loved but gives no thought to acquiring any virtues, any traits of character that would make her worthy of being loved. As examples of the second, of the desire to escape the effects of one's own actions, the crooked businessman who wants to be regarded as a pillar of society, the woman chaser who wants his wife to provide him with a happy home, the neurotic who, in any conflict between his wishes and reality, considers reality expendable and then cries that reality is set against him. All these and countless other examples are instances of men's rebellion against the law of causality. The law of causality permits them no miracles. It does not permit them the irrational. It does not permit their wish, divine supremacy over the universe. A psychiatric textbook tells the story of Frederick William of Prussia, who had the neurosis of sadism and simultaneously a passionate neurotic preoccupation with being loved by his subjects. It is reported that Frederick William dragged his subjects into a torture chamber and had them beaten while screaming at them, "I don't want you to fear me, I want you to love me." Well, you can observe that there are three ways in which Frederick William was violating the law of causality. First, his desire to create causes but to avoid their effects. Second, his desire to achieve effects without supplying their necessary causes. Third, his desire to reverse cause and effect. First, he wanted to inflict torture but to avoid its necessary consequence, its effect, the emotion of fear in his victims. Second, he wanted the love of his subjects but gave them no cause whatever to feel any love for him, and in fact gave them cause to feel hatred. Third, having no self-esteem, he felt that if somehow he could command the love and admiration of his subjects, this would give him a sense of his own value, so that admiration, the effect, would give him the virtue that should have been its cause. Now, you might think that this is an extreme, unusual case of neurotic irrationality. But now, is it so very different from the behavior of the kind of mother whom one encounters every day? The mother who, when her child is disobedient, slaps him back and forth across the face saying, "I'm your mother. I'll teach you to love and respect me." In Atlas Shrugged, there are many examples of the revolt against causality. The looters, the collectivists, want to destroy the cause of production, a mind free to act, but want to keep somehow the effects of production: food, shelter, clothing, wealth. They want to enslave the producers, to expropriate their wealth, and yet to have them continue to work happily, willingly, and creatively. It is the nature of causal connections that gives man control over physical nature, the power to reshape matter to his purposes. Of all the living species, man is the only one who does not have to adjust to his background, but can adjust his background to himself. He can do so only by means of asking the question why about any phenomenon of nature that he observes. To ask why is to ask what causes this. The law of causality is the ally, the tool, the best servant of the thinker, the inventor, the creator, the producer. And by the same token, the law of causality is the enemy hated by all mystics, by anyone who seeks escape from reason and from the obsoletism of reality. One of the most eloquent expressions of the mystics' antagonism toward the law of causality may be observed in their attacks on the faculty of reason in general and on man's senses in particular. At the start of last week's lecture, I pointed out that, in order for man to be conscious, in order for man to perceive reality, he must possess a means of consciousness, a means of perception. If you examine the mystics' arguments against the senses, you will see that the clear implication of their position is a desire for a consciousness that would be independent of means, a form of perception not bound by the law of causality. Last week I mentioned the standard example of the mystics' attack upon the validity of man's senses, the stick that looks bent when seen in water. I will now give you another similar example which you hear very often. Our senses deceive us, claim the mystics, because we know in fact that the rails of a railroad track are parallel, yet when we look off into the distance, the rails seem to converge to a single point. This proves that the senses are not to be trusted, that they give us a distorted and unreliable view of reality. First, observe that this argument contains the fallacy of the stolen concept, the use of sensory evidence to demonstrate the invalidity of sensory evidence. By what means did the mystics discover that the rails were parallel after all? Second, they are damning their eyes for giving them the full contextual evidence of everything within the range of visual perception. The rails appear to converge in the distance because the farther an object is from us, the smaller the image it casts upon the retina of our eyes. Thus, the rails and the space in between them would appear progressively smaller as they go off into the distance. If impossibly our eyes could contradict their own nature, if they could defy the law of causality and willfully ignore the context in which the rails were perceived, so that the rails did not seem to converge, that would be sensory deception. Our eyes in this example give us not merely the view of the rails, but also the evidence of distance. It is by learning to understand this evidence that man learns to grasp perspective and to estimate distances. Project what our eyesight would be like if the mystics had the power to alter reality, and if a mountain 2,000 feet high, 3 miles away from us, seemed as high as if it was stood straight against our nose. Then we would be trapped within the narrowest range of vision. A long range requires integration. The grasp of perspective, the discovery of causes, requires a very long process of thought and integration. That is what the mystic resents. Why, he cries like a nasty child stamping his foot at reality, why don't my senses give me automatic omniscience at any and every isolated moment? Another favorite argument of the mystics against the validity of the senses consists of declaring that the senses are limited and therefore untrustworthy because they cannot do two things at once or be in two different places at the same time. For instance, if I am looking at the front of you, I am unable simultaneously to see the back of you. That I am able to walk around you, see all the various aspects, and integrate them is apparently too much of an effort for the mystics. While he protests that he wants to see more than his limited senses permit him, while he protests that he is ambitious, the epistemological truth is that he is lazy. Here again you can observe his desire for instantaneous omniscience and his revolt against the laws of identity and causality. Whenever a mystic denounces limits, he denounces identity and causality. Since our senses have a specific identity, the actions possible to them are limited by that identity. A thing capable of unlimited actions would possess an unlimited identity, which means would not be anything specific, which means would not exist. Another and similar argument of the mystics against the limitations of sensory perception is the complaint that our eyesight is no good because we cannot see microbes or molecules or atoms or electrons. Well, again, observe the fallacy of the stolen concept and the demand for automatic omniscience. By what means did the mystic learn of the existence of microbes, molecules, atoms, or electrons? What human faculty devised the instruments that were necessary to perceive or to infer their existence? Furthermore, if we were able to see microbes, if that were the size and the range of our eyes, an apple would be hopelessly too large for us to see, and we would have to infer rather than perceive its existence. Another argument which the mystics raise against the senses, and which is totally irrelevant, is the argument from hallucinations. It is irrelevant because hallucinations are not even caused by the senses. If a man gets drunk and begins to perceive pink elephants, or if a person is mentally ill and sees figures or hears voices which do not exist, it is not a deception perpetrated by his eyes or ears, it is an internal projection of his malfunctioning brain. When the mystic argues that what man perceives is not reality, but only an illusion or a hallucination, then the mystic is again guilty of the fallacy of the stolen concept. Where did he get and what does he mean by such concepts as illusion or hallucination, without the existence of any valid perception of reality, from which illusions and hallucinations can then be distinguished? It is clear from all these examples that the mystic's basic motive is the desire for a causeless consciousness, a consciousness without any specific means of awareness. Their position in essence is as follows. Since man perceives reality by some finite, specific, identifiable means that function in a specific manner, this proves that he can never know reality. If somehow he could be aware of reality directly, without any means whatever, then and then alone could he be certain that his awareness of reality was valid and correct. Observe the ultimate paradox of this argument. The mystics regard man's sense organs not as the means, but rather as the obstacle to knowledge. If only you would destroy your eyes, your ears, and the rest of your senses, they tell you, you would achieve perfect knowledge. And that precisely is what they struggle to make you do by philosophical means. Now, finally, let us consider what precisely a mystic is. Mysticism is the claim to a non-sensory, non-rational form of knowledge. When an individual rejects reason as his standard of judgment, only one alternative standard and only one alternative psychological category remain to him, whether he chooses to acknowledge it or not: his feelings. A mystic is a man who treats his feelings as tools of cognition. He knows he's right, he declares in justification of any assertion because he feels he's right. He describes this process of acquiring knowledge as revelation or intuition or transcendental awareness, none of which concepts he is able objectively to define or communicate, which proves their superiority, he claims, to the kind of concepts that can be defined and communicated, since he contends the rationally intelligible is inferior to the rationally unintelligible. Scorning the senses and the intellect as limited, deceptive, and unreliable, he answers the request for an explanation of how he knows what he claims to know with the assertion that he just knows it, which means he just feels it. The basic formula of his credo, the formula to be repeated in answer to all questions or objections, is: one either feels it or one doesn't, more classically expressed as: to those who understand, no explanation is necessary. To those who do not, none is possible. But the rejection of reason is the rejection of reality, and just as the mystics claim to perceive by a means other and higher than reason, so they claim to perceive a reality other and higher than the reality perceived by reason, a special non-describable dimension known only to the elite who share their special non-describable powers. It is worth observing in how many crucial respects the attitude of a mystic is paralleled by the attitude of a schizophrenic. A mystic refuses to be constricted by the laws of identity or causality. So does a schizophrenic. A mystic believes in the possibility of contradictions and miracles. So does a schizophrenic. A mystic claims to hear inner voices that provide him with absolutely reliable, not to be questioned information. So does a schizophrenic. A mystic feels that his feelings are an infallible guide to truth. So does a schizophrenic. But a schizophrenic's feelings are not valid, insist the mystics, whereas the mystics, are. He can be certain of this, he assures us, because he feels it. When a mystic declares that he possesses a sixth sense which reveals information denied to men's other five, when he declares that his relation to ordinary men is like their relation to a man who is blind, the facts he evades are these: that the faculty of sight is the property of a specific material organ whose existence is objectively demonstrable, but the mystic's alleged faculty is not; that the knowledge provided by man's sight does not contradict and undercut the knowledge perceived by his other senses, but the knowledge a mystic claims to perceive does. One can communicate one's knowledge to a blind man by translating it into terms his senses can grasp. One does not demand that he sacrifice his senses, ignore their evidence, and walk through a wall declared to be non-existent by those who are able to see. One does not demand of a blind man that he violate his reason and accept the logically contradictory as true. One does not demand of a blind man that he substitute his feelings for his brain. A feeling is not a tool of cognition, and it is not a standard of truth. A man can feel that anything is true. He can feel that his wife does not love him. He can feel that he deserves a raise in wages. He can feel that the world is persecuting him. He can feel that Martians are controlling his behavior by electric currents from outer space. He can feel that he is the personal agent of a supernatural power, and he can feel that his favorite horse is going to win in tomorrow's race. The fact that he feels these things does not make them true. If feelings were the standard of truth, two men whose feelings led them to opposite beliefs about the same fact could both be right. Contradictions could exist, but A is A, and just as reality is not determined by what one believes, so it is not determined by what one feels. The mind, not the heart, is man's only tool of cognition, and reason, not feeling, is his only standard of truth. In a consciousness that is free of conflict and of any desire for the irrational, that which a man knows is true and right, he will also feel to be true and right. But it is not his feelings that provide the sanction of his convictions, it is reality. Faith is the acceptance of an idea as true in the absence of objective reasons or in defiance of objective reasons to the contrary. Faith is the equation of feeling with knowledge. It is not the acceptance of an idea on the basis of incorrect reasons, it is the belief that reasons are unnecessary. In defense of assertions not defensible in logic, the mystic Tertullian writes, quote, "It is believable because it is absurd, it is certain because it is impossible." Close quote. Faith is the willful invalidation of one's consciousness, the willful surrender of one's reason, and it is faith, not judgment, that every mystic demands. It is beliefs, not convictions, that he offers. One must first believe in order that one may then know, writes Augustine. It is blindness, not sight, that a mystic upholds as the precondition of understanding. Whatever the circumstances or conditions, whoever accepts the validity of faith, whoever allows the possibility of a single issue in which the judgment of the intellect may be subordinated to other claims, is committed to the basic premise of mysticism, which means to the anti-mind, which means to the destruction of the human tool of survival. The full extent to which the mystics' views are shared fundamentally by the neo-mystics of modern philosophy, who profess to be his opponents, is revealed in the belief of both that the acceptance of the absolutism of reason ultimately rests on an act of faith. Both schools agree that the validity of reason cannot be proven, and they differ only in that the neo-mystics claim to have faith in reason, whereas the self-admitted mystics do not. To demand that the validity of reason be proven is to be guilty of the same contradiction as to demand that existence or the axioms of logic be proven, the fallacy of the stolen concept. Proof and validity presuppose reason. Reason is that which makes proof possible and demonstrates validity. Faith and reason is a contradiction in terms. Faith is a concept that acquires and can possess meaning only in contradistinction to reason. Faith cannot antecede reason, it cannot provide the grounds for the acceptance of reason, it is the revolt against reason. Faith means belief in the absence of reasons. The mystic's question, why should I accept reason, has only one intelligible meaning. Why should I accept reality? Why should I accept existence? The first contradiction in such a question is that any demand for a why concedes the premise of reason. One is demanding a rational explanation. The second contradiction is that the only alternative to existence is non-existence, and non-existence does not exist. It is not a something that competes with existence, it is nothing. And one cannot accept a nothing, and one can merely blind oneself to a something. One cannot reject existence, one can merely cease to exist. This side of the grave, there is but one ultimate form of rejecting existence and refusing to be constrained by it: psychosis. One can destroy one's life or one's consciousness, but one cannot escape the fact that existence exists. Because reason is man's basic tool of survival, because reality is objective, because a process of thought can tell man how to grow food or build a dam, but a mystical intuition cannot, it can only leave him to starve or to survive as a parasite on those who choose to think. Because the rejection of reason is the rejection of existence, the conflict between rationality and mysticism is the issue of life or death.